happy to hear from our friends in Melbourne that they are now on Indigenous land and getting to spend a bit more time on it rather than just being locked away. We all pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise that the land we're all on was never ceded. You're all regulars. You know by now how we like to play this. Open the chat, turn your cameras on, tell us when we're sort of making nonsense and tell us when we're giving you pearls of wisdom. We'll call some of you up into the discussion as we go through the slides. But before we get into that, Katharine, Canberra, it's alive, it's spring, it's estimates this week, I believe.
It is estimates, yeah. It's a bit hectic because it's estimates, and yes, our parliamentarians are back for the sprint to the finish line. There's a quite heavy sitting schedule between now and the first week of December, and we are for this week and next, as well as the House sitting, we're doing estimates, which is always quite hectic for us because we're trying to cover multiple committees as well as what's going on in the Parliament. So, so I don't know, it feels strangely a bit more normal this session, even though we're all still in COVID restrictions. I think obviously it's quite difficult logistically for MPs coming from lockdown states. The Victorians, basically the Victorian MPs have had to work out when they appear during these sessions, because if you attempt to appear at all of the sessions, basically they won't get home until mid-December. So
that's like they're drawing lots, or is it a roster system? Well, I saw Claire O'Neill coming in asking a question over Zoom to committee. They're not doing that in question time yet, are they?
No, they are. They have remote questions.
Does Zoom work for them, or is it as bad as for you?
Oh God, no. I think the only real trouble they have had so far, sadly, was during Richard Di Natale's farewell valedictory speech, which he made from Melbourne. This was like the last sitting week before this one, and there was some diabolical problem during that, which was obviously
that's a pity, because he was a real contributor to the Parliament, wasn't
he? Yeah.
What do you reckon, just before we get into it, how will history remember Richard?
Oh God, it's sort of he won't thank me for saying this. He will not find this in any way amusing. But I always wondered whether Richard was in the wrong party. He sort of he had a sort of desire as leader, and he really won't like this because he doesn't like this framing of his motivations. But I think he tried to sort of grow the Greens base by moving slightly more to the centre. And looking to do deals where it was reasonable and in the interests of their members and supporters with the government. That was very controversial with the Greens base, and he sort of bought off that more looking for alliances perspective the longer he remained in the leadership. So there was, I guess that was an experiment that didn't quite translate. It didn't
really move the numbers, did it?
Didn't move the numbers, but fundamentally about Richard Di Natale, he is a really good person, a really good human, a good decent man who maintained, I think, a very healthy perspective on political life, and ultimately, I guess, made the choice that he had run his race in terms of contributions in this theatre, and I'm sure we'll seek to do things outside the parliamentary crucible. Yeah, I don't know. He won't thank me.
He'd actually be a good guy to get onto this at some stage down the track if we keep this going in long term, because I guess once you're freed of that responsibility, you might get some opportunities for some candid reflection.
Yeah. Well, I think he's always, even as leader, he was pretty frank about issues of political culture. But yeah, I don't know. I think sort of temperamentally he was like a Labor left MP. But he will not thank me for saying that.
Hey, the other exciting thing, you had an election on the weekend, your local council,
yes,
territory elections.
Yes, excuse me, the very important local ACT government.
What are our learnings?
Well, we had two interesting elections, didn't we, over the weekend? One in New Zealand and one in Canberra. I think our learnings, God forbid that we either of
Never
us
use
invoke
that
that
term.
word,
Yeah.
but we just both did in front of witnesses anyway. Never mind.
I used air quotes.
Oh yeah, sure. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's so you say.
Look at the video.
I demand a replay.
Yeah.
No. We did learn something from both of those elections. One, that progressive political parties can govern in the current age. That's interesting to know. Two, I think the thing that we can pull away from both of those results is the power of incumbency right at the moment. If you are seen to be a government that is doing a good job, and one of the primary issues on the ballot in any election anywhere in the world at the moment is management of COVID for obvious reasons. I think, well, Jacinda Ardern is obviously a rarely empathetic leader that's high on intelligence and EQ, right? She obviously is very popular, but she's also been seen within her own country to have managed COVID effectively in the interests of citizens. I think Andrew Barr too locally gets quite a lot of kudos both for his management of the bushfires in January, and also his management of COVID locally. Canberra's had a really good record on infections, for example. So two things, the two takeaways would be progressive parties can govern even in an age that seems hostile to progressive governments, and also that if you are competent at the moment, then it is very difficult, I think, to unseat sitting governments.
Yeah,
But
I kind of framed up my analysis of the numbers today on those two elections, and there's two readings. One is these two progressives won. The other reading is these two incumbents won. And as we go through the numbers, I suspect, sadly, that the second narrative is probably more compelling than the first.
Well, there are two narratives in the numbers, and everybody will see in a minute why. Peter has definitely set this conversation up in this way. Because it does stitch through a number of reads in the poll this week. But I think both things are true. Progressive governments can win and they can hold government if they're competent, but geez, it's really difficult if you are not an incumbent to project yourself into the political conversation right now.
I'm going to ask you one more question, because pausing awkwardly, I haven't been made co-host, so I can't share my screen yet. So Zareen can knock that over. But I guess the other, just give me a quick reflection on New Zealand. So really hard lockdown. From what you could see also, though, the opposition in that incumbents frame really struggling to find the point of criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's sort of like a lot of the preamble to that failure to get purchase played out almost before the campaign. The Conservatives in New Zealand were really struggling to land a blow on Ardern. And that could be seen sort of months in advance. It wasn't just something that manifested during the campaign itself. But this is the difficulty. And look, I didn't follow the events closely enough in New Zealand to know whether or not the Conservatives were just loops, sort of offering an alternative set of scenarios that just had no hope of flying with the public, or whether she's just very effective in crowding them out. I'm not close enough to the action to know which of those two things it was.
All right. Well, now I've managed to liberate myself. It was probably my incompetence rather than any one of my teams. So just to ground this, after the last election, we thought 2PP is probably not a very useful thing to fixate on, but it's probably part of the conversation. A quarter ago or 3 months ago, we put out our first 2PP numbers, but we did two things differently. One is we said we would only look at them as a set every quarter to train ourselves out of effectively the horse race mentality. And secondly, that we would include the undecideds, which we hadn't done in the past. And interestingly, if you look at any of the American polling coming through on the presidentials, they all keep the undecideds in. So if you look at all the polls coming out, it seems to be standard practice. I think we've come to that conclusion, not through, I don't think, John, there was any pollsters convention that said put it in. I think people that actually looked at it with a bit of rigor said this is probably a better way of doing it. So as you can see from this 2PP plus, if an election was called this week, the winner would be determined by the most number of people who are undecided, who decided to go with one side or the other. We can say here that, we've got a primary vote of the coalition at 39, which is down a few points from last election. Labor at 35, I suspect up a point or two from the last election.
That is up.
8 people sitting undecided. The Greens down a tad. That sort of 10% on either side seems to be baked in now. You get sort of between 35 and 40 with the major parties, and then you've got this middle ground that's up for grabs. And that's our democracy.
Yeah, well, ever thus, right? That's elections are always decided by the swingers. The percentage of people who are genuinely swinging voters, who genuinely do not have an allegiance of any time, and often some of it can be frustrating for people who get frustrated with compulsory voting, but often that cohort don't have a lot of information either, because they're not particularly engaged day to day with politics. But that is democracy, and I'll defend compulsory voting until the day I die. But anyway, yeah, the way we're expressing it now, Peter, both in news treatment, your analysis, and in these graphics, does sort of create this buyer beware tag from the point of view of the consumer of the information. You are made aware by this that, look, here's the score sheet for the major parties and the Greens. Here's the percentage, somewhere, between 10 and 0 of undecideds. They're going to decide the result, as you say, depending on which way they split and for which parties, then we have a winner.
Let's have a look at the trend line. This is actually a beautiful chart of the whole year. But if you go the last quarter, we're really from the 5th of August through to where we are now. And you can see that it's been, let's face it, a strong period in terms of primary vote. We'll look at the 2PP in a sec. You picked up something interesting I thought we might have had in this series. We'll actually go straight to the 2PP because it's kind of like a simpler story, that we may have had this road poll, but then you did what we never do and tried to ascribe a set of circumstances to explain why something might have been a bit different, and it kind of does make sense. So share that.
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, it could be a rogue, and would be a good sign if it was. But on the assumption it wasn't, the poll where Labor pulled ahead of the government, which I think was, God, just prompt me, Peter, was it September, early September?
Yeah,
I think?
like that. John will tell us, but I think it's early September,
I believe. Yep, is my memory. These charts just a bit too small for me to see because I'm joining you all on my phone.
Because you're on
guys.
your mobile.
Yeah. Well, it's just
sorry about that.
Just in case the tech fails, guys, and I've got to make a run for a cupboard so I can continue talking to you. Anyway, sorry. Yes. So where Labor pulled ahead, sort of against the trend of the polls in this quarter, coincides with the period where the government was under some intense political pressure about its management of COVID in residential aged care. That basically played out over the sort of last week of August and into early September. So if that poll wasn't a rogue, it's indicative of the fact that Labor managed to cut through on the aged care issue for that fortnight. And also that the community, that it sort of emphasises the degree of community concern about hundreds of people dying in residential aged care during the pandemic.
A couple of other charts that John's pulled out, given that these charts are so small on your screen, I'll get John to talk through these, but he actually found a couple of areas that if you break it down into demographics, there had been a sustained swing towards the coalition. So, John, I'll give you the floor and talk us through what you've found here.
Yeah, I think this just shows, again, one of the benefits of doing this quarterly, in that rather than looking for the immediate changes, we can have a bit more of a considered look back and see what happens. So yes, we as you guys have just been chatting about, the past quarter or so has been a sustained good time for the coalition. So we looked at really those areas where we've seen an increase or a bit of a change for them. And again, these are all from this year, but the chart on the left is people aged 35 to 54. And what you can see is at the start of the year before COVID, or at least in the early stages, Labour had a pretty strong lead in the 2PP plus measure. That starts to get a bit more muddled up during this obviously very unstable time. And then since this quarter, the coalition have started to pull ahead. So there's looks to be something there where the coalition is really starting to resonate and communicate well with this age group. Similarly, and obviously given the age group, this will account for a majority of these people in employment rather than people who are unemployed, retired, or perhaps students. Again, towards the start of the year, we saw Labour generally and consistently ahead of the coalition. Starts to get a bit muddled during COVID, and then coalition starting to pull away again. So again, is there something where people in employment are starting to see the benefits of what the coalition are talking to them about?
And this is the classic case. If we just got this over 1 week, you just say, oh, that's a bit of noise. But the fact that it stays there, survey after survey, starts giving you a little bit of confidence that something's going on. So, you know, we've had a story that the coalition does better with older voters, Labor owns younger voters, and this is the kind of transitory and the up for grabs demographic, and that, you know, you wouldn't want that to continue long term. You know, there are the numbers and then there's the context. So I guess in terms of the numbers, that does tell you something, doesn't it, Katharine, that for those that are kind of working age and of family age, there's been a bit of a shift towards the coalition.
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting that that's occurred in this quarter too, because obviously because the budget this year was delayed from May and pushed into October, we had months literally of speculation of what would be in the budget, what would be the key budget measures. And that brings you into tax cut territory and replacement income support territory for, you know, people managing the crisis. So I would say the message frame over this past quarter has benefited the coalition in terms of that slow build of content up to October. About what the budget would or wouldn't do. Obviously, budget hands back people's, you know, cash through tax cuts and contains employment incentives and incentives for business, which ordinary people will interpret as increasing the viability of their employers, right? So I think the political conversation explains some of that drift towards the coalition. The question for Labor will be whether or not by presenting an alternative to some of that stuff, they can capture the interest and imagination of working Australians as well. And, you know, then that gets back to our incumbency point and the difficulties associated with doing that. And,
you know, one of my working theses is that it hasn't really been a political contest up till now. I think the budget creates that moment where choices are made. There are different approaches. This will come out in some of the numbers we show a bit later.
Yeah,
and obviously the ability to create jobs is going to be one of those key tests. So we're kind of in this moment where the coalition said we've got a plan. We've been, you know, and if you think about it, you know, Scotty from marketing, God love him, he made his support measures job keeper, job seeker. I think they've got a job maker now. Like, it kind of,
there's all that branding.
It kind of works, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh no, it does. The simplicity of it does. It's a very translatable label that you can apply to a set of policy propositions that otherwise might feel remote from people. But the point is, though, and what I mean about the structural advantage of this quarter is that, you know, if you sort of compare the major parties, Morrison and the coalition kind of had the rails run on all the budget speculation, to the extent that obviously they're the government, the kind of journalistic, you know, kind of national conversation is about trying to get ahead of what's in the budget. Now, there wasn't an equivalent set of circumstances going on with people chasing what would Anthony Albanese's reply be, what would be the sum of those parts. That didn't happen until budget week, right? So as you say, there isn't a real, as in a conventional contest going on at the moment because of the nature of the pandemic and because of these points on the parliamentary calendar. So again, it is, if Labor wants to get itself back in the race, it's got to grab that opportunity of the budget session, as you say, Peter, to frame the future and frame what a more conventional contest looks like. But then your capacity to do that is also limited by events to the extent that, those normal conventions of politics, as in the normal cut and thrust and the battle of ideas, it gets crowded out if people are deeply anxious about their personal circumstances. So a little bit of that is sort of contingent on events, right? If we enter a period of COVID normal, which involves a vaccine and involves a bit of an economic recovery, we're in a different conversation to the alternate scenario, which none of us want to countenance, which is that we have a substantial third wave where there's no vaccine and we're still in crisis mode. So events are a genuine factor here, even more substantially than normal.
Thanks. Well, let's have a look at one more bit of John's analysis. There's some great questions going on in the chat. In fact, most of the questions are being answered by other people in the chat. So good work, people. You're doing us out of a job, but we will come up for air in a few minutes if anyone would like to make a comment or a question about these federal figures. I should have preempted. Today, we're going to look at the federal figures. We're going to have a deep dive into Queensland and then maybe have a look at a couple of budget questions at the end of it. So, John, the other bit that you were interested in was some trending in WA and Victoria.
Yeah, again, we looked at all of the states individually and we picked these two out specifically where they show the most movement. And I'll leave it up to you and Katharine to speculate the similarities and why this may be. But again, since kind of in the last quarter, WA, and we group several waves together for good WA just to make sure we have a sufficient sample size and we're confident about those results. But we're seeing an upward trend for the coalition in the 2PP in WA. Similarly, in Victoria, and whilst Labor is still ahead in the last quarter, you can see from around the 8th of July, the coalition's federal vote Victoria was around 40%. It reached up to 50% in recent weeks, and it's dropped down slightly in the most recent poll.
So one theory is that's noise, and the other is that's just a call and response on the length of the second wave lockdown. Look, WA, I struggle with, given that I think there's now a search warrant out for the few remaining people who don't support the Labor state government in WA. However, is there any scenario that says there would be a federal state differentiation over there? They've got a couple of strong WA state ministers in the federal government, I suppose. I guess our story has been incumbency is the strength, so it's not without the realms of possibility that people are rooting for both their state and federal governments.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of again, I'd like to be closer to the action in WA. It's sort of WA feels like another country this year, even more than usual, because it's
they finally got their wish come true.
Exactly. It's kind of because of this secession that's happened. It is a bit. I feel even more than usually remote from the dynamics on the ground in WA. And as you say, the sort of prevailing information we get, you and I, Peter, is that Mark McGowan is basically now one party state, right? Like his leadership approvals are kind of nuts, right? They're genuinely crazy. So you sort of think, oh, well, that's it, Mark McGowan for the next 38 years. But I mean, WA though intrinsically is a conservative state. It's a kind of coalition stronghold. So I don't know, maybe there is some differentiation between federal and state factors. I don't know. Maybe if there's anyone from WA in the chat, they might have a theory.
Yeah, put your hand. Anyone from WA, we'd love to know what's going there. And likewise, when we get to Queensland, I'd love to get a bit of a view from any of you. I saw a couple of people in the chat saying they're sort of hard at work on the campaign. So I actually called into a couple of the Queensland campaigners I know, but they're a little bit busy at the moment to join us.
Fraction busy.
To join us today. Couple of other quick ones. Approvals, nothing much to see here. Sorry, I rushed over that a bit.
No, but it's basically sort of status quo. The leaders are...
Scotty's looking 63-27. You'd take that. Very low, don't know. So people have formed their view.
Yeah.
I guess for Albo, the difference is there's still 27% of people to form a view.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting that they are, Labor is obviously sort of picking up on that sort of consistently large-ish cohort of people who are yet to form a view, because there's a lot more retailing of Anthony Albanese's personal story through Labor's communications at the moment. It's sort of, from our vantage point, you know, people who would participate in this group, and for your and my perspective, Peter, it sort of seems extraordinary that, given his length of parliamentary service and his relatively high profile, that people wouldn't really have a handle on who Albanese is. But I suspect that's a very Sydney perspective. I think in places outside of Sydney, people won't have really seen much of Albanese, except in sort of supporting roles over his period in parliamentary service. So Labor's got to do something about that. I mean, the positive of this sort of sustained cohort of people not on the fence, right, is that people aren't sort of stampeding in a negative direction. They're not kind of breaking in the direction that suggests, oh no, we really think this guy's a loser. It's sort of just sustained don't know. So I guess, like, that's both a problem and a plus, in the sense that he's not got a whole lot of negative freight, right? He's not widely despised by the Australian public and trying to make a case to be Prime Minister, but they do have to try and shift some of those people out of the don't know column.
Indeed. Look, the interesting thing, just jumping between those two, and I didn't mean to go to the preferred PM, but neither of them has really had a budget bounce or anything. Like, you know, we set up this whole thing that these are game changers, but it's kind of...
Oh, such bullshit. That, I'm sorry to be rude and to say a swear word.
What our ratings are on Zoom.
On the chat. Sorry, everyone. That was... No, but it kind of...
Go
is,
blue.
It is, no, but in the main, the budget bounce is more myth than actuality. I mean, it's sort of like, they are important, obviously, budgets in the Australian political calendar, because, like you say, they sort of frame the contest, the ensuing contest. So they do matter. And there's obviously a winner and a loser from the ensuing political contest that follows a budget, right? So it's not like it's, you know, mere rollover, no one cares. They do matter, but the idea that in and of itself, you know, budget night, then, you know, Scott Morrison, then, you know, Salesforce parts the sea, you know, leads people through to the promised land. I mean, it just doesn't happen in the real world.
One more, and again, I kind of think this is hardly surprising, but you'd take it if you were a leader, 50, 25, 25 in terms of preferred Prime Minister.
Yeah.
There we go. Let's come up for air and see if anyone wants to ask a few questions. There's a bit of talk in the chat about corruption, believe it or not, given sort of the shenanigans in New South Wales. And I think we actually had a Queensland opposition that referred themselves to the Crime Commission. We're going to look at some numbers in the state, so we won't sort of spoil our next little section. But what's your view on the pressure or otherwise of a federal independent commission against corruption? Why? I won't say what's your view, I'll say, how do you explain what is happening here? That's probably a more useful question.
Oh my God. Well, it's very frustrating, isn't it? Because it's sort of like we have a range of issues now, you know, setting aside what's happening in the States, we have a range of issues at the federal level that are highly suggestive that an independent commission against corruption would be a good piece of architecture in the sort of system of national governance. The government is, I think the fairest thing you could say about it is they are hastening slowly to put forward some sort of a model of a corruption commission. the thing, there is always resistance among the political class to the idea of anti-corruption commissions, not necessarily because people are dreadful and are hiding all sorts of venality, but because politicians think corruption commissions are kangaroo courts. They think that they can't, they're basically loaded against any sort of procedural fairness. And that is a lot of the hesitation that happens among parliamentarians about these groups. It doesn't necessarily suggest that everybody is secretly doing bad stuff. It just means that they're worried about the capacity of these bodies to basically just be stacked against them in appearance, if not reality. So that's partly it. Like, there'll be a range of views across the government about whether or not there should be a corruption commission proposal at all. That will explain some of the hastening slowly, but they need to get on with it. The government has said that they intend to do it. They need to get on with it, and it needs to be a decent body with teeth, because there's all kinds of events in the national space at the moment. We've been very focused at The Guardian over the last couple of days, yesterday and today, on the evidence before estimates committees about the Leppington land sale, which I'm sure lots of people on this Zoom call will be across. This is a land sale connected with the second Sydney airport that the Australian National Audit Office completely eviscerated the whole process of that. Now, that's now been referred to the cops. There are questions about whether there might have been criminality involved in this. So it's sort of, I've written in the past, I wasn't necessarily a supporter of ICAC at the federal level. I thought that politics was reasonably effective at self-policing, and also the mainstream media, of which I'm a proud member, was stronger. We were stronger. There were more of us, and we had more time to dig and probe and be a structural check. That's no longer the case. So I think, the case for a national corruption body is absolutely compelling.
I've got a question from Kit on that. Hi there, Kit. Are you happy to come up and put your question to Katharine?
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, Katharine. My question is, are there votes in it? Will people reward a government for implementing one, and will they punish them if they don't? There didn't seem to be, I don't know, there doesn't seem to, are there votes in the defunding and the funding of the audit office? Are there votes in it?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and probably not in a. The answer is probably no, in terms of at a decisive level. At a level that would get you to throw out a government. There's probably not, even though the public would say, I mean, Peter, if we put this question in a survey, what would we get at, like a super majority? We'd get 80+%.
Yeah, I'm sure John's looking it up as we speak. We've asked federal ICAC in the past. Yeah,
I'm sure whatever it is, it'll be high majority support. But are you going to chuck out a government because it doesn't do it, is really the question you're posing. And the evidence to date suggests not, although the government here in the hastening slowly has been quite clever, because they're not saying, no, we're not going to do an ICAC. They keep saying, yes, of course we're going to do an ICAC, brackets, maybe sometime over the next decade, close brackets, right? So I don't think you could, like, as pessimistic as the general answer is, right, no, there's not enough votes in it. But I would say the flip side of my pessimism is, you wouldn't want to be a major political party going to the voters at the moment, though, saying, no, we're not going to have an ICAC. We don't need it. That's a bunch of bollocks. You wouldn't want to be campaigning on that platform.
but like everything, it's also a brand, isn't it? And as Sophie and a number of people are saying in the chat, you'd rather have no body than a crap body that is just, doing, that gives you the visage that you're dealing with it, but actually not delivering anything.
Yeah, true enough. Yeah. So
anyway,
the model matters. Yeah.
On that note, which is kind of depressing, let's look at
a
bit more weirdness and back to our incumbency. Oh no, we're first gonna, hold on, John, do we have the state premiers? Yes, sorry.
Yes.
I'll give you this is the most interesting chart for me today, because we're in the field all of last week. I think the whole Gladys thing broke, it must have been the week before, was it? End of the previous week or the Monday morning last week.
I think. Yeah, I think it was
But
Monday
she has
morning.
not taken a hit. She has not taken a hit. Palaszczuk's in the middle of a very heavily contested election. She's hardly taken a hit.
Yeah.
Daniel Andrews, if you read the Herald Sun, is running a Stalinist state where people are being prevented from anything short of breathing. And he hasn't taken much of a hit. So, and we've spoken about Matthew McGowan before. Like,
yes, McGowan. McGowan is insane.
If anybody doesn't like him, can you please make yourself known? Because we really want to know what is going on
Put
there.
your hand up now.
So, incumbency at a state level seems really, really strong again, which would lead you to some sort of expectation that you'd rather be in the position of the incumbents in Queensland than the opposition. So let's have a look at the scoreboard, which we don't like to look at. It's not really dissimilar to the numbers federally, except it's a mirror towards the incumbent. If you took away, if red and blue were incumbent and opposition rather than Labor and Liberal, you'd almost have the same charts there and save a bit of time on the graphic design.
Yeah. Well, this is, back to the power of incumbency. It's a thing. Now, I mean, not at any price. And I'm sure, well, I heard from a couple of readers this morning, very cranky, that I had uttered the words Gladys Berejiklian and Dan Andrews in the same sentence because they are... Anyway, setting that to one side, I don't think any leaders are bulletproof. I don't think if you were really making a mess of things that the public would continue to be out there supporting you. I don't think kind of the pandemic has taken a lot of things from us, but I don't think that basic proposition of competence has shifted. But it is. We have spent a lot of this year, 2020, with this sort of government of nine, right? Scott Morrison and the premiers. We've spent most of the year, for good or for ill, with that being the projection of Australian governance. Opposition leaders of all stripes have struggled to get themselves into the frame in any shape or form. And when people are anxious, they like what's familiar. So I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to ask this question, obviously, over a couple of cycles, because Berejiklian is under a renewed pressure again after I think some sort of soft focus interview she did with one of the Sunday tabloids, I think, over the weekend, and that sort of created some follow-up questions on what was the nature of her relationship.
What was your view of that
MP.
form of damage control over the weekend?
Oh, well, it sort of was like, if you're going to do that, you do have to have your lines straight. I think you do. You do have to have a clear sense of what you want to impart through this sort of woe is me type soft piece. And she's created problems.
But it's clearly the strategy is to make it about the soap opera, which she can see she can run a defendable story out of, rather than make it about the appearance of corruption. And I won't,
Well, sure. And I mean, it's a very, fundamentally, it's a very human story. It's a very relatable story. People have all, everybody's been in a relationship that's been unfortunate, right? Like everybody understands that story. So if you, your strongest suit is to project that story. Also, what she's done, certainly towards the end of last week, I think she was, the Premier was sort of surfing the kind of baseline antipathy that people have about obeying media pack, right, in the middle of a crisis, right? People hate that. And now, because all of these press conferences are streamed live, this has been happening for many years, people see that combative dynamic all the time, really.
It was also very interesting when she was facing the censure motion in Parliament. She cleared the rest of the bench and just had herself there as a very solitary figure, having the whole thing against her as well.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a bit of saying, oh, this is all news, propping her up in the chat. I'm not sure about that. The News Corp journos very early called that she was gone and are now obviously invested in ensuring that narrative was accurate. Your colleague Anne Davies didn't see us. None of the press actually saw her surviving. I wonder what it will say about the media if she manages to hold on through this, Katharine, because this would normally be a technical knockout. What's happened over the last?
Oh yeah, well it would normally be a technical knockout for sure, and also it's sort of like if you take the Julia Gillard example, once something like this is hung around your neck as a female leader, it's you take water, you're damaged as the consequence of it. Or that was certainly what happened with Gillard in sort of, I guess, comparable circumstances. So it'll be interesting to see. But it depends on whether or not all the information is in the public domain or not. As yet, there may, more revelations may come. I mean, who among us could have said this, before last Monday that the New South Wales Premier was in an undeclared relationship with an MP who was, sort of mentioned in dispatches.
But it's interesting. So your sense is more needs to come now, or else she gets through.
Yeah, I think so. But that's how it looks from my distance. So I'm obviously not part of the baying media pack that is pursuing the Premier. And perhaps if I was closer,
you don't tend to bay, do you?
Oh, I can.
You have your moments of baying. You bayed about Angus occasionally, haven't you?
I can bay with the best of them. I'll have you know. But I'm not there. So I'm a bit more distant. So so it looks to me like. She's been pretty clever, Berejiklian, about framing her own disaster, and it would take, I think, a substantial new revelation to knock her off her perch.
Well, let's talk about Queensland. I've been hearing that you always hear this, that they were worried, Labor. I think a bit less in the last couple of weeks. My working thesis has always been as long as their borders hold and the virus is stamped out, they'll get there. But I am really interested to hear from any Queenslanders in the chat who'd like to tell us how they're feeling on the ground up there. John put together this chart which aggregates voting intention over the last period. So it's bounced around a little bit, John.
Yeah, it has. These are results obviously just from within Queensland, so we do have a smaller sample size there. So that's why you see a bit more variability in the results. But
One Nation's very low.
Yeah.
You do hear this actually. Sorry, John, I'm not cutting across you, but you do actually hear this a bit from people. I don't know if it's true or not. And again, I suffer a distance issue, but I have heard from people that One Nation are really not present in this contest, which is unusual, obviously, in a Queensland contest.
All right. Well, any Queenslanders, make yourself known. I'd love to hear what's going on. I did see one soul in the chat talking about, but maybe I'll get Zareen to unmute anyone from Queensland who sort of puts up their hand or says hello. Now there's Laura. I know Laura Barnes is a proud Queenslander. We'll call Laura up and ask her what her take of the lay of the land is. Just a sec, Laura. I'll unmute you.
I think I unmuted myself.
Oh, good on you. Hi. How you going?
Hello, how are you, Peter?
Good.
I just put a word in the chat. I mean, the word I hear from public servants across Queensland is that it is still very, very close. Yeah, that they are, many of them concerned about change of government, not only for their own voting preferences, but because of what happened last time when an LNP came into play here in Queensland. So yeah, that's the public servants. I think though in some of the regions, it's maybe a little more clear cut. And in that way, it's tending towards Labor is what I'm hearing.
It's been interesting from a distance, Laura, that there is kind of two campaigns being run, particularly by Labor. They've got their hard hats and high vis in the regions and then their renewable energy in the city. Is that dissonating or is that a word?
I will take it on. I think we should own that word.
Let's dissonate, yeah.
In a column tomorrow or something, that'd be good. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's always the case here in Queensland, isn't it? You know, we are a state of two states. And, you know, the challenge for major parties and politicians is to balance those competing interests and competing needs across the state. You know, very marginal seats in North Queensland. And of course, the impact of COVID in Cairns. So the marginal seats in Townsville, the impact of COVID in Cairns, and then Adani mining stuff in central Queensland always makes it a fascinating state to watch, I think. Lots of attention on Townsville, lots of attention in Cairns, as you would expect. Yeah, so it's all, you know, it's always interesting here in Queensland.
I saw Joe Barkworth there too. Are you able to unmute yourself, Joe? There's something there. No. Okay, we'll keep talking.
Hi.
Oh, hi, Joe.
Sorry about that. Was just trying to undo everything.
You've been on the booths?
Pardon?
You've been on the booths? You've been seeing
Yes. It's pre-poll's always a little bit difficult to judge because you tend to get the sort of older, rusted-on voters there. Although I have to say, I was surprised by some that I thought, really, you're not in the Greens vote? Wow. There's an awful lot of postal votes being picked out, so that's going to really sort of confuse things. It's pretty quiet on the pre-poll in a lot of ways, but the booth or the area, the electorate I was in, they said something like a third of the votes were going to be postal, which is huge. And if it follows the ACT with maybe another, at least a third on pre-poll, I can see it's going to be, they're not going to be making much money on the democracy sausage on polling day.
Yeah, that is a sad feature of current elections. That is true.
You know, I think obviously Queensland, the scale of its election is much larger than the ACT and the NT, the two elections we've had this year. It's interesting though to compare the logistics of an election in a still functioning society as opposed to what's happening over in the States at the moment, Katharine. 10-hour waits to pre-poll, hey?
No, I know. I just, the whole thing, I've sort of become now so nervous about the US election, I can't engage with anything. It's sort of, can't look at polls, can't look at pictures. It's sort of, I've become almost kind of, well, dysfunctionally anxious about it. But yeah, look, it's amazing. People queuing to vote. I guess that's a good sign, really, that people are engaged and up and out trying to participate. Oh God, I know all the polls say Biden's ahead. Oh God, I don't know.
Well, you'll be pleased to know the next Geekfest is the day before. We'll probably ask a few Australia-US questions. And then on election day, you'll be working. But for those of you that want, we're considering just having a watch party to open up the room, keep it on, have people jumping in and out, and we can watch the TV and then come back and sort of either commiserate or celebrate as we go to the edge of the abyss. I think it's going to be a moment in history for all of us. And I do remember 4 years ago watching it, and it kind of is just etched in my memory, that moment when people realised that Wisconsin was gone, and it was just a very, very strange feeling. It wasn't a good time to be alone. It wasn't a good time to be with alcohol either, if I remember. Let's round it off with my thesis for the next little period that you can tear holes in. We've got our last couple of budget. That's all back up, is it? We've got a series of questions. I better read these out because you've got a little mobile phone there, Katharine. So, how likely do you think the budget will deliver the following outcomes? It will place unnecessary burdens on future generations. 62% of people agree with that. 58% agree that it will create long-term problems that will need to be fixed in the future. So it's not feeling quite so good at the moment. 53% say it'll create jobs, which is the whole point of the exercise. 56 help Australia recover from the economic impacts of COVID, and 36 keep debt under control, which is probably the wrong frame at the moment. Anyway, what that says to me is that people are receptive to contradictory messages about this budget. And, you know, I guess for me though, the next slide and the final slide for today is probably the real framer for me. And it's this question, the second comment along here. 70% of people agreeing the government should take the recognition if their budget measures work, just as they should take responsibility if they do not. So my thesis has been that up till now, people have been prepared to give governments of all hues, as long as they're vaguely competent, a leave pass because, hey, it's the 1 in 100-year event.
Yep.
Labor can make this the moment of consequence from here on in. They're back in the game. And I think that, coupled with the stage 3 tax cuts, which for me, if you're looking at how to get Labor back in the game, stage 3 tax cuts are the secret sauce, because it unlocks the money for a different economic agenda. There's risks involved. It would require a full court press from the progressive movement and civil society, not to lock in their pet program, but to lock in the fact that it's safe for Labor to oppose the stage 3 cuts. But it feels to me that's your theory of change if you're going to get back in the game.
Well, I think it's setting that briefly to one side. I think that the sort of some of these metrics indicate a couple of things to us. They indicate that people are broadly okay with the government's very on-brand budget, but they're also worried about it. They're anxious about it. They don't think that approach is the sum of all wisdom. And I think we've got 50% or just over 50% saying, that there are alternatives to this as well, right? That suggests to me, as you say, Peter, like there is a return of accountability sort of implicit in that question, right? Like it either works or you take responsibility for it not working. We don't mind it. We voters don't mind it. We think that that these prescriptions of tax cuts and concessions for business will create jobs. But we think we're anxious about it. We're anxious about, we're a bit anxious about debt, anxious about how this sort of frames up Australian society over the coming generations. So, you can read that in a few different ways. It depends sort of what people are anxious about. If they're anxious about debt and the accumulation of debt, if that's an issue, then a sort of services agenda by Labor becomes more fraught, becomes more difficult. If they're anxious about equity, whether or not sort of giving tax cuts to people who earn a lot of money is a good idea over the fullness of time, then Labor's on a different playing field. So, look, while I broadly agree, the sort of contest that Labor's limbering up for is some sort of variant of a more present government versus Morrison and Frydenberg's outsourced recovery, I don't think that's dumb by any means. And I think there's some metrics here that would lend support to that being a sensible approach. But it just, I don't know, the slight hesitation I've got is that I'm not really sure what people are anxious about. They're anxious, but what is it? Is it that we think that the government's prescriptions are not really sort of building the social capital of the country, or are they worried that, our grandkids will still be paying back these budget deficits? I don't know. It's not clear to me from these numbers.
On that note, if the numbers don't make it clear, then we need more numbers, which is what we'll do. John will be getting it ready to go in the field next week. We'll see you in a fortnight when we will offer you ongoing emotional support, if you're up for it, Katharine, to get through the last sort of days before the and that's
Yes.
also Melbourne Cup Day as well. So we'll probably ask a few of our normal questions on horse racing, and we normally get something good and novelty out of that as well. So
well, it'll be delightful to spend the last day before the Trumpocalypse with this group. So thank you.
Hey, thanks for your time today. I know it's always a challenge when you're down in Canberra to sort of make the space, and we really appreciate it. Thanks everyone. It's been a great chat today, and everyone look after themselves. We're back on Thursday with a really special one, a retrospective on Jack Mundy's life and influence through the Green Bands with Meredith Bergman and Wendy Bacon, who were two women that went with Jack Mundy on the journey, and we'll have some great insights. So the Unions New South Wales has put together some fantastic old historical artifacts and photos. We're going to run a slideshow of those instead of political charts on Thursday and have Wendy and Meredith talk us through it. So please join us on Thursday. Otherwise, all look after yourselves and we'll see you again very, very soon. I'm going to clock off 4 minutes early today. Thanks, Katharine. Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.